On October 25, 1983, the Cold War briefly stepped out of the realm of speeches, summits, and proxy maneuvering and entered a live combat environment. It did not happen in Europe, and it did not involve nuclear missiles aimed at capitals, but it unfolded on the small Caribbean island of Grenada. American troops landed under fire. Cuban-aligned forces resisted, and behind every tactical decision lay the silent weight of a global rivalry between Washington and the Soviet Union. What took place was not a declared war between superpowers, yet it carried the unmistakable tension of one, an indirect confrontation where restraint mattered as much as force. By the early 1980s, U.S.-Soviet relations were at one of their lowest points since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Reagan administration had adopted a hard line, portraying the Soviet Union as an expansionist power determined to exploit regional instability. Moscow, in turn, viewed American military modernization and NATO deployments as preparation for confrontation. Mutual distrust shaped every strategic calculation. In such an environment, even a small island could become a test case for credibility, resolve, and limits. Grenada's strategic relevance was political rather than military. After a 1979 revolution, a Marxist-oriented government aligned itself closely with Cuba and indirectly with the Soviet bloc. This alignment brought Cuban advisors, construction teams, and security personnel to the island. A large airstrip was built, officially for civilian use, but its length and capacity raised alarms in Washington. U.S. intelligence assessed that the airstrip could support military aircraft, potentially expanding Soviet-aligned reach in the Caribbean, a region long considered vital to American security. For several years, Grenada remained a concern rather than a crisis. That changed dramatically in October 1983, when internal power struggles erupted into violence. Prime Minister Maurice Bishop was arrested and later executed by rival factions within his own government. Martial law was declared, communications were restricted, and armed patrols enforced curfews. The island descended into chaos. Hundreds of American medical students, studying at a local university, suddenly found themselves trapped inside an unstable and hostile environment. For Washington, the situation now involved American lives, transforming strategic concern into immediate action. The decision to intervene was made rapidly, shaped by urgency and uncertainty. On October 25, U.S. forces launched Operation Urgent Fury. Officially, the mission aimed to evacuate American citizens, restore order, and stabilize Grenada. Strategically, it also sent a message far beyond the island. The United States would not tolerate the consolidation of a Soviet-aligned military presence in the Caribbean, especially at a time when global tensions were already high. The invasion force reflected the speed of decision-making rather than ideal preparation. Army Rangers, Marines, airborne units, and special operations elements were assembled with limited time for coordination. Intelligence was incomplete. Maps were outdated. Communication systems between different branches were not fully integrated. Units landed at incorrect locations, and confusion marked the opening hours of the operation. Despite these challenges, commanders pressed forward, believing that delay posed greater strategic risk than imperfect execution. On the ground, American forces encountered resistance from Grenadian units and armed Cuban personnel. These were not unarmed laborers, but trained individuals equipped with weapons and prepared to fight. While no Soviet combat troops were present, Cuban forces represented a proxy element, an extension of Soviet influence without direct involvement. This proxy dynamic was a defining feature of Cold War conflict, allowing superpowers to compete indirectly while avoiding direct clashes that could escalate uncontrollably. As combat unfolded, the strategic context loomed over every engagement. Each firefight carried implications beyond tactical success. Heavy Cuban casualties could provoke international backlash. The capture of Soviet advisors, if present, could have triggered diplomatic crises. At the same time, any sign of American hesitation risked emboldening Soviet-aligned movements elsewhere. Both Washington and Moscow understood that Grenada was being watched closely by allies, adversaries, and non-aligned states alike. Moscow's response was carefully calibrated. The Soviet leadership condemned the invasion publicly, accusing the United States of violating international law and acting as an imperial power. Diplomatic protests followed, and the incident was raised in international forums. Yet there was no direct military response. Soviet naval forces did not challenge the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean, and Soviet aircraft did not appear in the region. This restraint was deliberate. direct confrontation over Grenada would have risked escalation disproportionate to the island's strategic value. For American commanders, speed became paramount. The faster control could be established, the lower the risk of international escalation. Within days, organized resistance collapsed. Key infrastructure was secured. American civilians were evacuated. Cuban personnel were detained or expelled. Militarily, the operation achieved its objectives. Politically, it demonstrated American willingness to act decisively in defense of perceived core interests, even under the shadow of Soviet power. Yet the Grenada operation also exposed significant weaknesses. Poor inter-service coordination led to confusion on the battlefield. Communication failures complicated command and control. Intelligence gaps created unnecessary risk. These shortcomings prompted intense internal review within the U.S. military. Grenada became a catalyst for reforms aimed at improving joint operations, highlighting the need for integrated planning and communication across services. For the Soviet Union, Grenada underscored the limits of influence achieved through proxies alone. While Moscow could support allies ideologically and materially, it lacked effective options to counter rapid U.S. intervention in regions dominated by American military presence. Grenada demonstrated that influence without direct protection was fragile, especially when escalation was deemed unlikely by the opposing superpower. International reactions reflected the complexity of Cold War politics. Some U.S. allies criticized the invasion's legality, questioning the precedent it set. Others quietly accepted the strategic rationale, recognizing the broader context of superpower rivalry. In the developing world, Grenada became another example of how smaller states could become battlegrounds for larger powers, their internal struggles amplified by global politics. The Grenada Crisis also highlighted the role of perception and signaling in Cold War strategy. For Washington, the operation reinforced credibility, demonstrating resolve at a time when American leadership sought to counter perceptions of decline. For Moscow, restraint preserved strategic stability, avoiding escalation that could spiral beyond control. Both sides achieved limited objectives without crossing red lines, illustrating the delicate balance that defined much of the Cold War. In hindsight, Grenada did not bring the world to the brink of nuclear war, but it added to an already tense year. 1983 saw multiple incidents that strained U.S.-Soviet relations, from military exercises misinterpreted as potential attacks to heightened nuclear alert levels. Grenada fit into this pattern, reminding policymakers how regional crises could intersect with global rivalry. The legacy of October 25, 1983, lies not in the scale of combat but in its symbolism. It demonstrated how indirect confrontation functioned during the Cold War, with superpowers engaging through proxies, rapid interventions, and calculated restraint. Grenada was a microcosm of a larger struggle, where force was applied carefully to avoid triggering catastrophic escalation. For the U.S. military, Grenada reinforced the importance of readiness, coordination, and clarity of objectives. For the Soviet Union, it highlighted the constraints of proxy influence in regions dominated by American power. For the international system, it served as a reminder that even small conflicts could carry global significance in a divided world. October 25, 1983 stands as a case study in Cold War crisis management. It shows how decisions made under pressure, informed by ideology and strategic calculation, shaped outcomes far beyond the immediate battlefield. Grenada was small, but the confrontation it hosted reflected the immense forces at play during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. In the end, U.S. forces withdrew, Grenada's political trajectory changed, and the Cold War continued, yet the lessons of Grenada endured. It revealed how quickly local instability could draw in global powers, how restraint could coexist with decisive action, and how the shadow of superpower rivalry loomed over even the smallest theaters of conflict.